Hello, online pipe community. Ethan, Parsimonious Piper here. And today we do have some more morsels for mental manducation. We'll be diving back into C.S. Lewis. But first, in a Peterson dairy rustic finished 106 billiard with that pretty mocha swirl stem. You can see that. I have got some Mylan Tobacconists, Our Walnut, their walnut match. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with walnut, it was an old codger blend, not a walnut-flavored tobacco, and this is Mylan Tobacconist's match to it. I have never had the original. So I can't compare this. I can only evaluate it on its own merits, which is probably the most fair thing to do with a match anyway. Now, if I understand that correctly, this has Burley, Virginia, Cavendish, Oriental, Latakia, possibly some Maryland. It's a bit of a kitchen sink blend. And that's a problem for me because, as many of you know, I don't have a discriminating palate when it comes to subtle blends. I really only taste one or two components. And here I get a little bit of sour and a little bit of smoky. So I'm guessing I'm getting the Orientals and the Latakia, but nothing that particularly grabs me. So on my 5.5 star scale, this would be a 3. It's good. I certainly don't mind smoking it. It has a good flavor. Those of you with better noses and better palates might tease some more out of this than I can. Will I buy it again? No, probably not. But it's definitely not a bad blend. Like I said, those of you who can taste more than I can might get something more out of this. Well, today, for our morsels, we are going to return to C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, and we're going to look at chapter 2 this time. If you recall, chapter 1, Lewis left us with two concepts. The first being that on observation of societies around the world, there seems to be some common moral law, used to be called the natural law, but there seems to be some common core moral law that's shared among cultures around the world. Now, there are differences, but he stressed the differences are smaller than the similarities. And the second thing that he left us with was that we all seem to know innately and or through having been taught, but we all seem to know what these core things are, and we agree that these are in fact good moral rules, and yet we don't live up to them. Another universal truth. There's no culture on the planet that has individuals in it that perfectly live up to that culture's standards. Now, in chapter 2, he wanted to shore up those first 2 points just by addressing some of the objections he had received. Now, unlike a normal book that we read nowadays, if you recall, this book was originally delivered in the form of radio addresses during World War II. And it was only later put down in book form. And I think originally it was actually even published as 3 different books. So he had people, after the first radio show aired, he had people who wrote in and voiced their objections. And he was able to sort of identify the 2 main thrusts of objections that he was receiving at the time. And here's what they were. The first of the main objections was that it seems the moral law that he speaks of is really nothing more than natural instinct, herd instinct. And he objects to that objection for a number of reasons. All right, consider what your instincts are for protecting the herd. In some situations, you will have opposing instincts. For example, a fight or flight response. You may have instincts to do both. You see someone being attacked. You have an instinct to defend that person physically. You have another instinct to flee from that person's attacker at the same time. Those are both instincts. Where the moral law comes in is in forcing you to choose one of those and to acknowledge that in your mind you ought to do one of those two things. That it's not just a matter of practicality, but that there is actually, I should do this, even if I don't want to do it. Even if the stronger instinct in me is to flee, what I should do is help protect that little old lady who's being mugged. Those are competing instincts. And it's only the moral law that tells us that there is, in fact, a should when we have opposing urges or instincts. So he points out that there is a difference between having an instinct or an urge to do something and having a sense that one ought or ought not do something. He used an analogy that I like because as a pianist myself, I can relate to it very well. He said, consider a piece of music. The notes to be played are very much like our instincts. When there is a choice between many, the paper, the music, tells us which of those we are to play. It can't be a note itself. And in a similar way, the moral law tells us what we should decide between competing, conflicting instincts or urges. The moral law itself, in that sense, cannot just be part of the herd instinct. And it sits on top of and outside it. Further, in the herd instinct setting, Lewis points out, and I think he's correct, that our instincts, our natural urges, are not innately right or wrong in and of themselves. They don't, on their own, have a moral content. And he uses some very strong urges. The sexual urge, the urge to fight. And he says these urges are not in and of themselves good or bad. It is moral law that harnesses them. We encourage sex with one's spouse. We discourage sex with one's neighbor's spouse. We consider one to be moral and the other not. We discourage the use of violence to harm or steal from someone. We encourage the counter use of violence to stop someone from doing so. Both are violence. Both are an instinct to violence. One is right, one is wrong. There are many other examples that you can give, and his point though is that there are no instincts that are always good. The instinct to love humanity, for example, and he gives would lead one, if it were pursued all the time, would lead one to ignore justice, to ignore responsibility, and even to, he doesn't point this out, but even to cripple the very people that it is supposed to be helping. We see this very frequently with generational welfare dependency. But that's a political statement that Lewis doesn't make, so I won't go there any farther here. Now, the second that he talks about, the second major objection that he received was that these things, this moral law that he speaks of, this is simply social construct that has been taught to us. It's not somehow natural. It's only learned. Here he does a partial rebuttal. The rest of his rebuttal comes later on in his writing. And the part that he addresses right here is not to confuse something being taught with something being invented. Just because the moral law is in fact taught from parents to children, from one generation to the next, doesn't mean that the parents invented that moral law, or that whoever they learned it from invented that moral law, etc. Just because something is taught doesn't mean it's invented. And again, he uses an analogy that I just love because I'm a mathematician. The fact that a child has to be taught his multiplication tables doesn't mean that the teacher invented the multiplication tables, or that the mathematical establishment invented the multiplication tables. No, they discovered them. The laws of mathematics don't change at all. We discover them. We may prove new things mathematically, but something that is true mathematically is true regardless of whether we know it. And that's one of the beauties for me. It was one of the things that attracted me to mathematics in undergrad and grad school, was this notion that there is truth out there that we can discover, and it remains true even before we've discovered it. Once we've discovered it, we can teach it to others. It's very unlikely that a 6 or 7 year old is ever going to come up with the multiplication tables on their own. That doesn't mean they're not true. It doesn't mean they're not inherently true just because they have to be taught. Just something to consider. Now, he doesn't here make that next leap that therefore the moral law he's speaking of must be true. No. That's not what he's saying. He's saying just don't discount it just because it has to be taught, or that it often is taught. Now, the other half of that is the idea that the moral law is just a set of social conventions. And he makes a distinction that I think we ought to draw. And that is social conventions, things like, the one that my mother always talked about for women here in the U.S., you don't wear white after Labor Day. That's a social convention. He talks about driving on the left or right side of the road. That's a social convention. The style of clothes that you wear, the kinds of foods that you eat, these things are all taught. They're social conventions. Do not kill innocent people isn't a social convention. That's a moral imperative. There's a difference between not wearing white after Labor Day and not murdering your neighbor. And we understand that difference. We don't always articulate it well, but we know there's a difference. So he wants to make sure that in this discussion, we limit ourselves to discussing things that truly do have a moral component to them. And he finishes up his chapter by coming back around to his statement from chapter 1. That despite all of the differences in what really are social conventions, the differences between what we truly consider to be moral and immoral, those differences are much smaller, culture to culture and across time. And the similarities and the unity, the consistency of what we consider to be moral is a lot greater than the difference. Are those the only two objections that could possibly be raised against his first 2 points? Let's go back to those. That there seems to be this curious idea worldwide that there are things that are right and wrong, and we share most of those in common, at least at some level. And two, that nobody actually lives up to that perfectly. Are there other objections to those 2 points? Or keep in mind, we're not jumping ahead here. We're not going to jump the shark. Yes, there probably are. If you have other objections to those, feel free to shoot me an email or leave them in the comments. I'd love to discuss them with you, maybe in a video. But for now, start looking ahead to chapter 3. And we'll continue this next week or in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, light something you like. Probably won't light this again. So I'll tell you the same thing I said a while back. If I have not sent anything to you yet, be the first person to comment and say, I'd like to try that Mylan Hour Walnut. And I'll connect with you and send you the rest of what I got. But light something you like and enjoy your afternoon.